All right, and welcome again to today's Survivor Circle. John Michael, I will turn it over to you. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you again for this opportunity. This is incredible. I am so excited with the guests we have today. This is Steven Procopio. He is amazing. He's from Boston, Massachusetts. He is known as how do I say this? I want to make sure I say this properly. He is the father of male trafficking. He's the one who discovered it and brought light to it and brought people's attention that males are being trafficked as well as females. So I'm so excited to have him here. Stephen, please say hello to everyone.
John Michael, my dear friend and colleague, thank you for inviting me today. I've been really looking forward to this. And to Becky as well, thank you for the introduction. And, I'm very happy to be able to answer questions and participate with questions from the audience as well. So I'm really looking forward to it. Anything I can do to help.
Great. Let's start this first one off with a really hard one, Stephen. Are you ready?
Yep.
What got you involved with anti-trafficking and finding out about males and stuff like that? Tell us how you got into it.
Well, 17 years ago, when I still had brown hair, I was a faculty advisor at the Boston University Graduate School of Social Work Field Ed Department. And we would have a group of non-faculty, the faculty advisors were social workers working in the field that would be assigned a number of students to monitor them through their field education process. So the dean and the assistant dean, there's about 28 of us, I think, 28 social work. And once a year, they would ask one of the faculty advisors to give a presentation on their work. So it was March of 07. That's how it's embedded in my mind. And I had a colleague of mine who I'd known for many years who was doing a presentation on trafficking of female youth under the age of 18. And she started off by saying, I'm going to give you this presentation based on my work. I work with trafficked girls under the age of 18. And as an aside, I want to say we kind of sort of think it happens to boys. It's less than 10%, we think, if that much. And boys don't get pimped. And it's just gay boys that are doing this, and they're doing it of their own free will. So I sat there and not having done any work in trafficking, all my work was sexual abuse of males. So with all those bullet points that she gave, without knowing, I said, no, 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 no. I don't buy that. So I invited her out to lunch to have further conversations about it. Her position did not change, but regrettably, we had no research done in the United States on trafficked boys. And the only research that was done by a woman named Susan McIntyre, who's Canadian, and she wrote a study on trafficked boys called Under the Radar. So my colleague, I had her there for a long time. I kept asking her lots of questions. And I think very politely after a while, we kept going around in circles. And she said, well, if you think it's such an issue, why don't you do something about it yourself? So that's when I told people I had my Oprah moment, because that passion of that topic hit me like a ton of bricks. And we all listen to Oprah, right? So she connected me with various members of the trafficking community in Boston to have meetings with. And they all had similar positions. We just don't know. Boys aren't disclosing. We have no research. We have no evidence that it's even occurring. This is a female thing. And this went on and on. So I partnered with a youth agency that worked with homeless boys and or boys at risk of homelessness. And I just asked them if I was interested in this particular topic, can I somehow work with them around this? And they said, well, we're willing. We don't have money for such a program. We're not really sure it's an issue, which interested me because these were homeless kids, all the kids are boys at high risk for trafficking. But they hired me as an unpaid consultant. And so I was working another job that was very flexible. And then I did a series of focus groups. And it was eye-opening in terms of the research that I found that, in fact, boys do get pimped. Boys have high risk factors based on adverse childhood experiences like girls. And it's not just within the gay community. There's plenty of non-gay boys getting trafficked, but they're much more underground based on homophobia and sexism. And so I just really got a wealth of information to dispel the information that I was given at that workshop. So that agency gave me a 1-year seed money to do further focus groups and to start seeing if we could develop programs for boys. And then in those focus groups, I really wanted to know if there was a program for trafficked boys, what types of services would you need? And they came up with, supported housing, long-term behavioral health care, compassionate health care, help with getting a GED, and employment counseling. So that's how I wanted to develop a program based on those designated needs to help support them. And unfortunately, that seed money after the year was no longer available. So there was another program in Boston that I was had a girls program, and they were interested in developing a boys program. So they hired me. So my first year working for them, I worked 18 hours a week. That's the only money they had. And by the time I left 4 or 5 years later, we had 5 full-time staff members and a full caseload of street kids, or kids referred to us by the Department of Children and Families. So in that period of time, I applied to various conferences on trafficking and did presentations on boys. And I was the only one doing presentations on boys. So I became nationally known as the boy expert. And I had so many people coming up to me after my workshop wanting help around how to do this, because they kind of sort of thought it happened in their own communities. So that's where I got my national recognition, because I was the first one in the country doing it.
That's incredible. And I have to say thank you, because it truly has affected my life in many ways. Besides being a friend of yours and learning from you, and just what you have said and what you've forged forward for all of us has given us a chance to be able to speak up and share our stories, which is really important. Now, before we go on, because I want to come back, I have a lot of questions about that, but there's something that has really been on my mind today. And it's September 11th. We've had this horrible thing happen, in 2001. Every time around this period, I myself get very emotional and very depressed. I found myself today sitting on my couch, not able to do anything that I had set up to do, without even realizing that I was in this. Is this something that happens normally for a lot of survivors? Do we actually see stuff like this happen and we reflect with it? Or is it something more personal? Do you know?
Well, there is a brotherhood and sisterhood of survivors. And when I talk to because I'm doing private practice as well as consulting, I'm doing private practice now with survivors. I tell my clients we all have filing cabinets in our brain. And when you open up the filing cabinet, there's manila folders in there, and each manila folder has a different topic. Sad stories, abuse stories, survivor stories, exceptional stories. And in the survivor file folder is not only your story of survival, but the topic of survival goes in there. It's a trigger memory. So you will relate to other people who have survived egregious events. And I remember 9/11 like it was yesterday. It was a very big deal. I watched 60 Minutes this past Sunday night, and they did a whole story with the children of firefighters that died who now have become firefighters in New York City. It was very emotional. The sons and daughters of men who had firefighters that had died there. And, so for me, it represented loss of innocence, because that clearly was the loss of innocence. And my mother's cousin's grandson died in the World Trade Tower. He was a financial person with Goldman Sachs. So that brought that a little bit closer to home. So whenever we hear stories about bad things that happen to good people, it triggers also our sense of, it brings that filing cabinet open where that information will come out. So that's the ongoing brotherhood and sisterhood of companionship of surviving various events.
So if I hear that correctly, it doesn't matter what the traumatic event is. The survival method is how we connect with everybody else.
Exactly. Yeah,
And
you
so
have that
that's,
connection. You have that connection with other survivors.
well,
But
I'm so glad you shared that.
different stories. It's
Yeah,
different
different
stories.
stories.
But you're a survivor of this or that or whatever else people survive.
Wow, that's amazing. It's just amazing. The whole thing, because I lived in New York for many years as well, and that was a very powerful day, and it always will
Right.
be.
Oh, very
So
much so.
let's pull it back to trafficking of males, and we're not negating the females at all. We don't want to,
No.
we're not doing that, but we're trying to shed light a little bit on that. When you started to discover that males were being pimped, was that through like one-on-one conversations with young men?
Well, the focus, I'm glad you asked that question, because when I approached this organization as an unpaid consultant to do focus groups to try and develop some research, they said to me, do not talk to, I did 13 to 16-year-olds and 16 to 24-year-olds. And they said to me, do not talk to them in the first person because you'll lose them. Do not consider them to be trafficked kids because they'll recoil and step back and they won't own it, especially for the non-gay youth. So I had to talk to them in the third person. So I went in there, I introduced myself, I told them I was a social worker, that I was interested in learning more about boys that may be trafficked or sexually exploited. And since you're young people and you have knowledge of what's happening in the Boston streets, I would like to know if you have any information about what you're witnessing or what you're knowing that you might be able to help me. And that's what engaged them. Because I wasn't saying, okay, John Michael, tell me about your traffic experience.
Right.
So when I did it more like in the third person, they gave answers. I knew they were speaking on their own behalf, but they never said it was them.
Right.
Well, these guys, this is what's happening to guys over on the Boston Common. These are happening to the guys under the bridge. These are what's happening to the guys in the hotels. And it made it sound like I'm talking to you about my friend, but they were
Right.
really talking to me about them. So I got a lot of great information about, that boys do get pimped, how trafficking manifests itself, and intrafamiliar pimping that goes on, people pimping out their kids for drug money, for a what we now know to be forced criminality. A lot of that was going on, and kids on the street standing by hotel rooms waiting for the wealthy men to come by and pick them up and drive under the bridge or bring them into their room in the hotel. So there were so many different factors. And then I said to them, well, I'm curious about who the buyers are. And they said, generally speaking, and this is a general statement, generally speaking, 35-year-old white males married with children. And my female counterparts have said the same thing about girls. And I said, okay, so married men with children, why do you think they're buying kids on the street? And they all said because they tell kids that they can do things to them or have them do things to the buyer that their wives won't engage in. So it's sexual activity that the guy's wife won't let them do, and that's usually oral and anal sex, generally speaking. And so that's why they're picking up boys. And I said, well, if that's the case, why aren't they picking up girls? Well, they have daughters. They would never think of doing that to their daughters because it would remind them of their daughters. So, I think boys are more dispensable. The thing that was sad is like the sexual fetishes also is another thing that these men had sexual fetishes that they could do it and force the boys into, and their wives wouldn't engage with them that way. So the different categories were escorts, street kids, internet dating, and a combination of like phone sex. So it was sort of like a caste system because the escorts were the only group of boys that were in the 16 to 24 age group, and those boys were the only ones that personally knew their offender because they were always on call for them. So the guy usually was a business person. He could call home and say, I have a board meeting tonight, I'm not coming home. I have a business trip, overnight business trip. So there was that, the men of higher professional stature that could get away from home more frequently. And what those boys said is that and they were only on call for a certain number of men. They were not on the street. They were not on the internet. They were just on call for those, say, 6 men. And the boy said that we have the power over these men because they know that I know their name. They know I know they're married. They know I know where they work. And if they try and screw me over, I'll be on the phone with one of those people and out them. So that was the sense of control they had over their victimization, as it were, where the other kids did not have that because everything was more or less anonymous. And they were exploited much more so, much more, lots of beatings, like and fetishes that the other boys in the escort category did not have. So it's sort of like a caste system. The escorts were sort of off to the side, and the others, they considered themselves to be on the upper echelon of the society. And there was resentment with the other groups with that. I tried to enter into the male sex work community. I was introduced to a man in Boston who represented male sex workers, and very politely he told me to stay away from our community. We don't want your work with us. We are doing this because we want to, and we don't need your help. So, that's an ongoing thing, the issue of sex work versus, how that's perceived. And some people in our community don't think it's work, but they think it's work. They think it's abusive. They don't think that way. So that's a category of older adults that, I was not getting into with my program, because with my program, it was boys under 18. Now in my private practice, I see male survivors up to the age of 62 that are still going through their healing process from when they were teenagers.
So you said a couple of other things, and I want to see if we can just I hate labels, but I think it might help people. You said the escorts, you said the sex workers, and then you said the street workers. Can you differentiate a little bit, just give an idea if we were able to look at this on a piece of paper, the difference between the three, although they're all being abused in a certain way. But I know a lot of the sex workers that I knew said that they chose this job, this was their business, and that they were not upset by what was going on.
Correct.
Some of the escorts that I knew had a problem with it because even though they knew who the person was, there still was a power dynamic going on. And sometimes they weren't getting paid, and some of the escorts had a pimp or somebody that was they called him a manager when I was in Boston,
Yeah,
when I lived there.
right.
They were called managers or my agent, and we,
Mhm.
all these different names. And then the street workers were the kids who, were really struggling with in many ways. And so I think you said it correctly, and I'm glad you said it's a hierarchy within
Right.
this world, and there is one, and they
There is
look
one.
down on each other, you know?
Mhm. And you know, nowadays, especially in the like in the Boston area, we don't see. I mean, I used to live near one of the hotels that in Boston that, you know, when I would come home from work, the boys would be across the street smoking a cigarette, leaning up against the building, just waiting for and the cars would drive by to pick them up. You don't really see that anymore because hookups are done online now
Mm,
and through Grindr, Tinder, or other apps. So people are connecting through that, and then they make their arrangements. So you don't see as much of that. The other people might know about gentlemen clubs where there's
mhm.
women who are doing pole dancing that are sexually exploited. For boys, it's in the gay clubs, and the manager is in cahoots with the manager,
Right.
and they split the money, and the boy gets some of the money. And in the winter, the boys from Boston and New York are brought down to Florida, like Fort Lauderdale, to work down there for the winter. I've heard that the southern border states still have a lot of kids on the street for some reason. And then in certain parts of the border of Tijuana and San Diego, and
Mm,
there's trafficking through that channel there. So it's very pervasive. It's happening everywhere. It's happening next door. It's happening. It's every community. And if people say, "Oh, not in my community," everything's happening in everybody's community, and
yes, exactly.
it's just so underground. And and the the thing we're much more aware now. I have a college student now who's trafficked from 13, and he was a lot of forced criminality. He would be sent into people's homes in the middle of the night to steal their TV sets. It's just crazy, risky stuff because his offender knew that if the kid got arrested, he'd go to juvie, but
Right.
if he got arrested, he'd go to adult jail. So, that was the differential there. And this kid was so programmed not to trust anybody but his pimp. I mean, he's not with them anymore, but he struggles with such paranoia right now and inability even to trust family members because he was so cognitively abused around his reprogramming. It's
That's
sad.
so interesting. Yeah, that is interesting, and I want to talk about that also. I just wanted to share a little bit of a story. I ran into the retired fire chief here in Kettering,
Mhm.
Ohio, actually, and we were talking a little bit about it. And he said that when he was a fire chief, they would go into certain buildings, and the kids would tell them that they needed help, that they were trying to get help. And he said, and most of them were boys that he saved that were being trafficked. And nobody to this day will talk about it. And he was like, I was right there. They would pull it aside and then we would call the cops and the cops would take them away. And the next thing we know, we go to another building and there they are again. They were put right back into the system at that time. So it was kind of crazy. But I was impressed by the fact that the child or person wanted to tell someone, and they thought they saw the firemen, they saw the building burning, they thought that this could be a way out. And it's kind of crazy. And I know through my experience, I tried to tell people too. And I think we know it's not right, although we have been normalized to believe that it's okay. And that's what I want to come back to this because you were talking about this young man, and I wanted to ask if he normalized things so much, did he even ask permission to go to the bathroom?
He had to ask permission to do anything and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, because they're
So,
so afraid they were going to run away.
for example, if they were in the back seat of his offender pimp, if he needed to go to the bathroom, he had to ask if he could leave the car because he had to go to the bathroom.
And he carries that with him probably to this day.
Right. And if it was just urination, he had to stand right outside the car and urinate wherever they were and then get back in the car. So yeah, a lot of cognitive distortions, very sad case.
And so it makes it hard to make decisions. And I think that's what people don't understand, that, you know, there's the physical abuse, but there's also this mental stuff that goes along with it. And it's groomed. That's the only word I can think of, constantly onto them, that they lose their ability to make decisions and choices because it becomes a way of survival. And it becomes a
Exactly.
way of not getting hit, not getting hurt, not getting burned or anything. And so it's amazing that if we repeat that action, we actually start doing it as a habit, and we carry that with us. Wow. All right. All right. How are you feeling? You feeling okay?
I feel fine. Thank you.
I do too. I'm just you bring up so many new things every time I talk to you, and I see myself in these stories that you're sharing, and it just makes me want to say, I get it. I understand what they're saying to you, and I just want to verify that.
Well,
Again,
the stories are ever evolving because we have new people coming into the community with different. I mean, I think for the male trafficking community, there's that brotherhood of the community of commonality, but everybody's story is unique to themselves. And there's so many different variations on a theme about experiences of trafficking. And that's why it's important that we have to keep an open mind to variations on a theme. So when I do my trainings, I talk about what I've learned through my specific work, but I also let people know you have to be open to variations on a theme as you meet people back in your own communities.
and speaking about themes here, you've been noted to say that I'm going to try to read this so I say it correctly. You've been noted that a dangerous myth persists that an adolescent boy who is exploited by an adult is somehow lucky to get the sex that every young male supposedly craves. And that's one of the things I think that's really interesting. What do you feel about that? And can you explain that a little further? That whole mythology that, oh, like, you know, again, I'm going to bring up a situation here in Ohio where we had a substitute teacher who abused 3 sophomore boys. And the only reason that it was reported is that the boys were talking about it amongst themselves, and some girls overheard it. They reported to the principal. The principal then turned it in. And when it went to court, the parents of these boys wrote letters in defense of the teacher, saying that she helped make their boys men.
Mm. You know, that's such a common thing that boys are subject, you know, that locker room talk. And, you know, there's something about what's called the rite of passage for like a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old boy having sex with a woman. They're lucky and have a notch on their belt. And uh, um, if the offender is male, usually what the offender will say to the boy is that I'm teaching you how to be sexual with someone. So what I can say, you know, I think it's sad that those parents did what they did, but what we know from a clinical perspective is if someone is exposed to sex before their emotional development time, they may be able to have the sex, but as they get older to 20s, 30s, and 40s, there's a dramatic increase in depression, anxiety, and substance use based on what happened to their sexual victimization as teenage boys. And some of the men that I've dealt with, you know, many of them, you know, have long-term depression, anxiety, and on again, off again issues with substances based on their victimization during their adolescent years. So, you know, the 14, 15-year-old boy can have sex with his older teacher and people can applaud that, but you don't understand the psychological trauma that goes with that will manifest itself as they get older. And a lot of times, you know, you'll hear for non-gay people, you know, you'll hear things from, well, my husband is not emotionally connected to me. He feels distant to me. He's drinking beer on a Sunday afternoon, watching the football game. That's all he seems to be. Your husband's depressed, lady.
Yeah.
Your husband is depressed. And something went on to bring on that depression where he's emotionally detached from you. But we
I
don't
know a
look at
friend.
that. Yeah, we don't look at
I,
that as such.
I know a friend whose husband likes to watch Little League baseball
Yeah.
and drink beer and completely lock himself off. And the World Series, the Little League World Series comes along, you
Mhm,
cannot talk to him because he's stuck
mhm.
in that room. So that's I never thought about that. And also, if we look at the LGBTQ community, and everyone says that's what you wanted anyway, so you
Yeah.
got what you wanted. So no one sympathizes on that side because you must have wanted it, or it would never have happened.
Or it's
And that's
considered to be a rite of passage.
yes, and they're doing you a favor, and I've heard that a lot. Um, I'm trying to look at some other things that we have going on. Is there anything that you want to jump up and talk about right now? If we led you to anything?
Well, I think so much of my direct service work or my training work, well, with my training work, I'm still amazed that after 17 years, there's still so many people in the dark about this topic,
And why is that?
whether you're social worker, psychologist, law enforcement, or whatever. And I did a training a couple of years ago at a college here, and I overheard this so I gave my presentation, I heard this law enforcement person say to somebody else, I never knew that stuff happened. And it's not brought to the forefront that this is an issue. But I also think in the human service field, when we have frontline case managers or social workers, um, there's such a turnover, like 2 to 3 years. So sooner train a group and then a new group comes in. So we're always having to address the changing patterns of staff people. There's still an incredible amount of homophobia and sexism that goes with this topic. And it's not recognized that this is not an issue of sexual orientation. It's about the abuse of power and control. And regardless of your sexual orientation, your race, your ethnicity, your gender identification, if you have the risk factors like the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, or you have issues of runaway behavior or homelessness or substance abusing families, you're pretty much you're at risk enough that if a social worker or somebody has a male client like that, it's worth further assessments to be done to figure out what's going on. That's easier said than done because I remember I had one kid who I worked with who never disclosed to me for the first 16 months of my work with him. And then he just finally came out and told me. So there's a lot of so with a lot of this work, well, people say we're not going to start a program because no one's disclosing. So you have to find those ACEs, the risk factors and whatnot, and assume they're at high risk and start providing services. So the services my program provided were a lot of ancillary services that kids needed support with. Not so much we're just going to deal with trafficking and nothing else. It was the total trauma of their life experiences that were dealt with. And it's very relational. So these kids are not trusting of adults. They've maybe had difficult families, their offenders are adults, and adolescents normally don't gravitate towards adults because they're more connected to their peer group. So a lot of this is the worker needing to be present without question and allowing the kid to come and go as he pleases. no restrictions on that. Let the kid know you're there if needed, and provide. So like the Department of Children and Family Services kids we had, they were lucky if they saw their state social worker once a month because they just couldn't get to them. We were seeing them 2 to 3 times a week. So we were developing a much more proactive relationship with them. And so they had a tendency to gravitate more towards us than their social worker. So that, and all the kids I ever worked with, that one kid who took some 16 months, he was the only kid I ever worked with that was able to graduate high school. And a lot of these kids, just, based on their trauma, never had the capacity to sit in traditional classroom settings. And the only reason why he graduated high school is the school really supported him in doing what they could to help him get through his coursework.
That's
And
fantastic.
yeah, only one kid though, out of all those kids. So they're falling through the cracks even after their high school, and what happens to them on the street. And in one of the focus groups I did, one of the boys pointed his finger at me and said, "You could have 5 lifetimes and not experience one iota of what I've been through in one lifetime." And I thought that was very compelling.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah,
agree with that. That's amazing. And I also just want to say, I think people are falling through the cracks. Like and I'm just going to bring up my case, the fact of being an elite athlete, and no one ever thinking that this is happening with our athletes. And we know the stats, depending on where you look at stats, stats mean nothing unless you really know what's going on. But the latest stat is 1 in 4 females and 1 in 6 males, and sometimes it's 1 in 13. It doesn't matter.
yeah,
Are sexually abused before 18. We just had the Olympics. There were over how many athletes at the Olympic Games? And if
right.
those stats are even close to being true, how many of those athletes were abused? And I will take it even further, how many were trafficked? In my case, as an elite diver going all over the world and everything, I was being trafficked to different people who were called my sponsors.
Yeah,
And nobody is willing to look at that level because we don't want to look at our athletes as being abused because we put them up here on a pedestal. I mean, if it wasn't for Ali Raisman and Simone Biles coming forward and saying, this happened to us,
right.
we were a part of this, would that whole case have gone any further?
Mhm.
You know? So how do we get people to hear I mean, I feel like I'm always screaming at deaf ears when it comes to, I don't even know what they want to call it now because they don't call it trafficking in the streets. It's, I don't even think they even put it in commercialized sextortion yet. But
Mhm.
it's an event that's happening here in the States where athletes are being trafficked within their sport,
Mhm.
and no one is willing to look at it. Is there anything we can do about that?
Well, I think, you know, in my frustration of people not being up to par with this topic, I did a training last month for the Plymouth County. Like in Massachusetts, each county has the child advocacy centers. So they have social workers working with kids at risk, especially around trafficking. So I was down in Plymouth. Plymouth is the largest county in Massachusetts, so they cut it in half. So when you do a training, they have to do 2, one on one side of the county, one on the other. And so I did phase 1 last month. There were 60 social workers. And at the end of my presentation, the whole day with different presenters. At the end of my presentation, I was asked 2 questions by one person. So it was almost like a deer with the headlights, the deer's looking at us with the headlights. And I sat there and I said, you're working with trafficked kids. You're working with youth at risk. I'm giving you information on boys, and this is not registered for you until I came here to give you information on boys. So you're going back to your home offices and you're not aware of the boy connection. So I talked to 2 of my friends that invited me to come down. I said, look, this happens to me all the time. No one will ask me questions or 1 or 2 questions. And I know that they'll go back to their home office and then things will start to register after the fact. because then it'll open up conversation. And I've gotten some emails from people where they acknowledge that it was a lot of information. It was new to them and it was hard to hear, but they needed time to digest it. So I have to give up, I have to release the fact until the day I retire, this 101 work is going to continue. You know, I'm stuck with this 101 stuff, and I know you've heard it, and because it's necessary in terms
But
of preliminary education.
I get that, and I just want to say something in your behalf. Every time I've heard you talk about 101 or seen videos that you've done, I've learned something new because you don't let it become stagnant. You're
Yeah,
constantly bringing in new
new stories.
experiences, new
Yeah,
information. And so it's not just 101. I mean, a person could come to see you 5 times a year and get something new every time. And that's what I think that you're so brilliant about is that you're still grabbing information and sharing it with people who want to hear it. And the problem is a lot of people don't want to hear it. And there are a lot of people that are saying, wait a second, um, the police aren't helping us, the judges aren't helping. A lot of times they're involved,
right.
you know? And I know in my case, I felt like I couldn't go to the police because they were a part of the group that I was being pushed
Exactly.
around. And we were told from the very beginning that we were not allowed to say anything or that everything would be, you know, worse things would happen. So it was just this whole crazy game of power. And you're right. And I think a lot of times, a lot of these organizations today are trying to take trafficking 101 and shove everything into it. And you know, 2.5 hour, 4 hour, you know, presentation. And after 15 minutes, people are just like zoned out
Yeah,
because they can't
it's a
hear
lot of
it.
information. Yeah.
You know?
When I think of men in the military or men in the law enforcement community, I also wonder how many of them are survivors of some form of sexual victimization and they just keep it at bay because they don't want to have to, it's too hard of an issue for them to deal with, so they just ignore it because it's too much of a trigger. And it's
Yeah,
especially in the non-gay community, it's a major trigger in the non-gay community because they don't want to be associated with being gay. And if
right,
you had a male offender, you must have been gay.
right, right. And it's such a confusing time at that age anyway. Do you know what I mean? If we think about it, a teenage body is going to respond if it's being touched. It doesn't matter who's doing it, and however long it's doing it, there's going to be a result. And I think people forget about
Yeah,
that. They just assume, oh, you must have really liked that. And it's like, well, no, it had nothing to do with that. One, I'm freaking scared. Two, I don't know what you're going to do next. Are you going to pull a gun out on me or what? So I'm just trying to get through this as best I can. And
right.
I don't think people look at that. They're ready to still victimize the victim.
Mhm.
It was your fault. It's sort of like, what were you wearing kind of thing that we say to girls and stuff like that. So that's kind of just, it's still ugly.
Well, it's not been unusual for my clients to tell me that for those that disclose, because a lot of clients never disclose to their families, even their wives,
Mm-mm.
after 25 years. And one of my clients never told his wife. He has 2 college-educated kids, great job. He's never said anything to his wife. And he talked to a large Irish Catholic family, and he finally went and talked to one of his brothers who blamed him for the trafficking. You should have stopped it. You were a guy. And that is another reason why males don't disclose, because it's fear of retribution and not getting it acknowledged as what it was and not what you think it was. It's not their fault. And when I close my sessions with my survivors every week, I think they're getting tired of hearing me say this. I always say, remember, this wasn't about what you did. It was about what was done to you. That's your mantra. Make a bumper sticker out of it, put it in your bedroom over the mirror, and just keep that. Because men will drop into self-blame from time to
Totally. I
time.
was getting ready
But
to
they
say
will.
that.
Yeah,
We feel like it's our fault. We caused it. We
exactly.
allowed
Yeah,
it to happen.
Mhm.
I carry that with me today. And then there's
Mhm.
also the whole survivor guilt.
Right.
How I survived through this. You know, how
Mhm.
did I get through this and some of the friends I knew didn't? And it's crazy how much we will create a false story about ourselves. And so, and another point I wanted to make really quickly is we spoke with Carrie Carter last week, and she deals with wives who had been, you know, domestically violented or from their husbands who are sex addicts. And
Mhm.
they're doing a whole thing now that she's finding out that the men who have been doing these sex actions were abused earlier in their lives.
Mhm.
And these are doctors. These are prominent people who get married because that's what they're expected to do, but they never took care of what happened. And now at this age, they are finding themselves creating situations. They're like acting out, or they're trying to figure it
Mhm.
out themselves, and the poor wives are being left behind. And it's
Right.
just crazy. It's not
Yeah.
crazy. It's scream for help is how I look at it.
It's a vicious cycle
Yeah. And
of
I love the
abuse.
fact that you talked about the fact that males rarely report because of all the things that we have, the stigmas and everything, the fear and all this other things. But it's also what you just said too, is the shame. If I said I did this or I was a part of this, what does that mean about me? And what are you going to think about me? And I love the fact that you shared the story about the young man who didn't tell you for 16 months, 16
16
months.
months. Yeah.
He was seeing if he can trust you.
Mhm.
It was all about learning to trust and to find out, where is this going to go? Are you going to be there tomorrow? You know, how can I keep this going? How do I know that I'm going to be with you the next day? And it's daunting to me. And what you're saying just brings up so much emotion out of me right now. So
Right.
thank you.
So I had one client, a 16-year-old Latino kid, and when I was working, we had uh, agency badges we had to wear, so you know that we could be identified. But of course, the kids never wanted the badges shown, so I used to put it down in my shirt because they didn't, you know, if they bumped into a friend or whatnot. So he was so addicted to Dunkin' Donuts colada that I would always take him to Dunkin' Donuts to get his colada every week. And we're walking down the street. I had my badge inside. I'm a white male, older white male. He was a Latino. This guy pulled up and asked me how much I wanted for the boy.
No.
And the boy looks at me like, you just fucking did this to me, you asshole.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
gonna now make this kid think I'm a pimp. You know, I went ballistic. And the only thing I could do is say, get the fuck out of here. And the guy took off, and we had to process with the kid. But the way the kid looked at me, like he freaked out,
Of course.
thinking that this guy knew me as a pimp. I'm his social worker. You know, so I appreciate not wearing the badge, but you know, that was a major concern for me when I would go out, because I would do different activities. We'd go to the park, or we'd go to get our colada, or you know, we do different activities. And that really blew my mind. Just pulled up on a main street in Boston and asked me how much money do you want for that kid? Absolutely freaked out that kid. Freaked me out too. But it was
Oh
crazy.
my.
Absolutely
Oh,
crazy.
oh wow.
Yeah.
All right. All right. One quick question. Can you give us some, I hate this question, but I feel like everybody wants to hear it. Any signs that someone is being trafficked? Any, anything that can like bring up that flag and say, hey, we need to look into this. What kind of like actions or things that we can look for?
Well, if you know a boy, if there's any change in behavior, so if all of a sudden he becomes quiet, he becomes socially isolated, he refrains from connecting with other boys, withdrawn, depressed, but he wasn't that way before, that's a telltale sign. Or if you have a kid that's doing a lot of what, you know, acting out behavior, you know, is another sign that the acting out needs to be assessed as to what the underlying issues are that brought him to that place. A change in grades, lack of being able to maintain, you know, employment, like if you're working McDonald's or something after school, trouble with authority figures is a big one, and just a lack of mistrust in the world. Then anything related to homelessness or runaway behavior is a major one.
Major red flag.
Yeah.
Now, with all that said, what are some of the hopes that we have? What can you bring? What kind of hope can you bring to these people who are maybe being trafficking, maybe hear this?
Well, I think you know, in what I just defined as the risk factors, what's up to the provider is, you know, here again, it's all relational, and it takes time to build relations with people. And, you know, we have to work with organizations that allow the free flow kids to come and go, and not say, well, the kid hasn't been here for 3 months, so we're going to close this case, which is true in the old days. We used to have to do that, you know, before I got into trafficking work. So nowadays we need to have an open service delivery system, and then we just need to be able to be present and build relationships with kids. And if they want to play a board game, you play a board game. If they want to shoot a basketball, you do that. If they want to go to the park, you do that. So it's like just developing and not expecting that they're going to disclose, not to have the end result that they must disclose to within a certain amount of time. They just need to have a stable person in their life that they can come to trust, and it will come out. They'll let you know in due time, but you have to give them that time.
And I think that's what a lot of people don't have, or they don't want to give that
Yeah,
time. They don't
exactly.
want to let that child come forward and
Mhm.
share. And you're absolutely right. And I think that's such a hopeful statement there. I just would like to, is there anything you would like to say before we close up today? This went so
This was
fast.
just a pleasure for me to be able to work with you, John Michael. You
Oh
know, I
my
love you
God,
dearly.
yes.
You're my
Same
colleague
package.
and dear friend. And, you know, I'm always glad to be able to provide information to people about this important work. And a very dear friend of mine from the UK said, you know, Stephen, you have to realize that you started a pathway for people to get into this work. So at least acknowledge, and I don't really acknowledge that a lot, but the truth of that is you developed a pathway for so many other people to come after you. And I think I'll just put that on my epitaph.
Yeah. Wear the badge for sure,
We're
because
the bad.
yeah, you paved the road for me to be able to
Yeah.
share myself and come forward.
Great.
So I
My
owe so
pleasure.
much to you. You're just an amazing man, and you're such a loving, empathetic, and giving man too. So
Thank you so much. I
anyone can reach
appreciate
out
that.
to you for more
Absolutely.
information, right? Perfect.
Absolutely. Whenever they want. Yep.
Great. Yeah. Becky, would you like to come back?
Sure. Thank you both so much. Wonderful conversation, and so many things that I, was behind the scenes going, yes, and oh my
Yeah.
gosh, yes, I've
Yeah.
thought about that and heard that. One of the things that you mentioned, Steve, I recently assisted some colleagues with at Zero Abuse with a training for investigators of internet crimes against children. And it really didn't occur to me until I was in this training, how these investigators, if they themselves are survivors, how they navigate this particular kind of work. They're having to deal with crimes against children, but also interviewing the offenders and listening to their justifications for their abuse of children, and all those things were just rolling around in my head. So when you talked about police earlier and just how they kind of navigate this issue, it really kind of rang a bell for me. But
And generally speaking, law enforcement is so machismo
yeah,
that
yeah,
that's another barrier, unfortunately, that they
yeah,
have to live up to that role.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I also, you know, my background is more with sexual assault and
Yeah.
abuse advocacy. And I didn't realize until I started working with Survivor Space and started, you know, collaborating with some trafficking survivors, that there was this dynamic with sex workers, and
Yeah.
that kind of
Yeah.
disparity. Is it abuse? Is it empowerment? You know, exploitation versus empowerment, and that is a very, very real kind of challenge. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
So just
You know, we
one
didn't
thing
bring,
came to mind, if I have a quick second, is
Yeah.
that based on what we know for, and this is true for both boys, based on a continuum of sexual victimization, a large, very, very large number of both boys and girls get into trafficking as a result of having a sexual abuse history.
Yeah.
So it's that ongoing victimization that, based on that continuum, that happens.
Yeah.
So when we're looking at kids, but they're only identified as sexual abuse, we have to also think, well, we need to investigate if there's a trafficking component to that as well.
Yeah.
and,
Absolutely.
and also I just want to bring up this whole OnlyFans on social
Mhm.
medias now. And there's a big discrepancy about that. Why some people feel it's okay for people to have an OnlyFans and just be by themselves and showing their body. That's not considered sex work. That's not considered prostitution because there's not another person in it and they're making lots of money. And then there's other people saying that it is. And it's just this constant, it's kind of a new wave. It's another one of those new categories that we put in there. And now we have, you know, escorts, we have OnlyFans, we, you know, and
Mhm.
it's going to change a lot of things. And can OnlyFans end up going into trafficking?
Right,
How do we know that? We don't know.
right.
And the whole thing is that everybody looks at OnlyFans as that's their choice. They're making that choice as their own. And is that anything detrimental? Is that going to mentally affect them years later from now all as well? Do we know that?
Exactly. Yep, the long-term psychological effects.
And it keeps going and going and going.
Yeah. Oh, well, I thank you both so much for
Thank
today's
you very much.
conversation. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate both of you for what you do and for having this conversation today. Thank you so much.